Secretary spoke to this yesterday, that you're involved in quite a different time zone. You're sleeping when we're awake, so she was empathetic to the situation of having difficulty connecting, but she's made clear to him that when he's available, she's ready to talk.
She doesn't think that this is an issue of such importance that maybe Foreign Minister Lavrov might, get up a little bit earlier or go to sleep a little bit later.
Well, it's not as if we haven't been having plenty of discussions with the Russians on this subject. Right. As Mark said yesterday, we've had consultations at the level of our embassy. We've had Jeff Feltman in Moscow. We've had Deputy Secretary Burns talking to multiple Russian counterparts. Secretary had a chance to see the Russian permanent representative, Mr. Churkin, in New York, and Susan Rice, Ambassador Rice, will certainly be working with the Russians over the next couple days.
And how have those consultations gone so far? Yesterday they threatened to veto a resolution. So it doesn't sound like the consultations thus far at the lower level have produced anything satisfactory for you, no?
Well, I have to say, having sat in the session yesterday, and you saw, I'm sure it was a public session, the Russian view was that we need to support the efforts of the Syrians to find a peaceful resolution to this problem. So I think we are all working together to find a way for the UN Security Council to support the aspirations of the Syrian people to end the bloodshed and to live better. We've obviously got hard work ahead of us on the resolution, and that work begins in New York this afternoon.
Much of the Russian objection has been that this would be a slippery slope into some sort of military intervention in Syria. What sorts of assurances are the Americans and others offering to underscore what was said at the table yesterday, that this is not in any way a military type of resolution?
Well, first of all, the Secretary was very clear. Many other foreign ministers, including Foreign Minister Haig, Foreign Minister Juppé, were extremely clear in their statements in the Council and in their statements publicly to the press that this is not Libya. We are not seeking foreign intervention. That is not what the bulk of Syrians want. We are seeking to support the Arab League's plan, which involves dialogue among Syrians about a path towards a more democratic Syria. But with regard to the precise negotiations that have to happen, Roz, as tempting as it might be to negotiate in public from this podium, we're not going to do that.
So would you be agreeable to a clause in the resolution that unequivocally state that under no circumstances will be going Libya's way, and allow a margin for military interference as we did in Libya?
Again, Saeed, I'm not going to negotiate the text of this resolution from this podium. That's not appropriate, but we are working hard in New York to come to a text that everybody can support.
Does the Secretary feel snubbed by the fact that Foreign Minister Lavrov isn't taking her calls?
I think she made clear last night in her press availability that she is quite relaxed on this subject and is available for him when he's ready.
Was the Russian position what you expected, or was it more hard than you expected?
Again, I'm not going to give a grade to the Russians. We need to have these consultations on a text in New York, and we're going to let that go forward.
Do you expect the Russians to show perhaps a little more flexibility in the next 2 weeks as the violence continues and the repression continues as well?
I think sitting in that chamber yesterday, and particularly hearing the extremely strong statements of the Arab representatives in the room, the Prime Minister of Qatar, the head of the Arab League, the Moroccan Deputy Foreign Minister presenting the resolution, there was an enormous sense of concern about the violence and about, as many people said, since the Council first started looking at this situation months and months ago, we now have thousands more dead. So I think you could feel a palpable sense in that room that the Security Council has got to take action. Obviously, we've got hard work to do on the precise text, as I said, but I think there was a strong commitment on the part of everybody, frankly, around the table for the Security Council to take its responsibility to protect peace and security.
Well, not everybody around the table. There was one Arab there who you didn't mention, who didn't seem to think it would be such a good idea. What did you make of what the Syrian ambassador had to say?
You know, I don't think that the Syrian position at the table surprised us.
Well, what about
like
his historical, his reach into history with Syria had a parliament in 1919. Syria can't understand why the Arab League is bringing them to the table and not Israel for occupying Arab lands, that kind of thing.
Well, I'm not going to get into the Syrian's head. I think
No. I just want to know what was the Secretary's reaction to that? What was the administration's reaction to this?
You know, I think that Foreign Minister Haig said it well when he said that, you know, there seems to be blame all around here except at the feet of those responsible for the violence. So, you know, our view remains that if the regime had been able, willing to solve this itself, as, you know, was the initial expectation, we wouldn't be in the UN Security Council, but clearly the regime is not
I understand,
proving
but do you think
capable or
his
willing.
comments were appropriate given the situation?
I'm not going to give his comments a grade. He spoke for where his government has been, which is not in the right place.
Victoria, on the Russians spoke also of the armed element, the armed factions that were also attacking other communities and civilians, including they attacked the Russians, I think, in Damascus and so on. Do you agree, or would let's say a coming resolution include something like that?
Again, Saeed, I'm not going to get into the wordsmithing of the resolution from this podium. That's the work in New York.
Right.
What we have said many times
Right.
from this podium, and what the Secretary has said, President has said, is that the vast majority of the violence is being perpetrated by the Syrian regime. The degree to which we are seeing groups trying to defend themselves now, this is precisely the situation that the Secretary was warning about yesterday in her intervention. Violence needs to end before it begins to spiral out of control.
Now, lastly, with the increased defection from the army, from the Syrian army, are you concerned that Syria may be sliding fast into a civil war?
This is precisely the situation that we are all trying to avoid by trying to get the regime to end the violence. We have seen an increase in defections. We've also seen the regime's violence increase as it has worried about losing members of its armed forces. So this is part and parcel of the cycle of violence we're worried about.
Victoria, when this building says that all sides need to put down their arms, and then you say in the same breath that the amount of violence being perpetrated by the regime is increasing, isn't it natural for people who oppose the regime to want to try to defend themselves?
Well, again, this is the concern, that as the regime becomes more and more vicious, and the Secretary cataloged some of our concerns, you do have people trying to defend themselves. You have people who are armed trying to defend themselves. And this is the dangerous spiral that we're worried about. This is precisely why the Council needs to act, since the Assad regime has been unwilling to do what it needs to do.
Wouldn't it be immoral, though, to say to those who are trying to protect themselves that they should lay down their arms? I mean, it might make things, better on a moral level, but in terms of life or death, that's how they protect themselves from the regime's soldiers.
Roz, I think you're putting words into our mouths. We have said all along that we want violence on all sides to stop, that this is not this is not going to take Syria forward. But what we also make clear is that we lay the bulk of the responsibility at the feet of the regime.
Do you expect the Council to vote on the draft resolution by Friday?
I'm not going to put a timetable on it. Obviously, as we see the violence increase, as we see the deaths increase, we want the Council to act as soon as possible, but they've got some hard work to do in New York. Michelle?
A new topic
Yeah.
on Egypt. I wonder, there were some conflicting reports overnight whether or not the Americans were taken off the travel ban. I wonder, are they still in the U.S. Embassy there? And has anyone in this building met with the Egyptian delegation that's come to Washington?
Regrettably, we have not yet settled this situation. The American citizens that we talked about are still on the embassy compound. We are continuing to work with Egyptian authorities to try to resolve this case. With regard to the Egyptian military delegation, as we said yesterday and the day before, delegations of this kind generally come from Egypt a couple of times a year. We do meet with them. Frankly, it's another opportunity to underscore for them and for Egyptians in general our concerns about the situation with the non-government organizations. I think they arrived in Washington yesterday. They are scheduled to meet with Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs Andrew Shapiro and Assistant Secretary for Near East Jeff Feltman here at the department. They'll also be seeing folks at the Pentagon, and they'll be seeing folks on the Hill, as we understand it.
When are they meeting Feltman and Shapiro?
It's either today or tomorrow. I'm not exactly sure, Arshad, but we'll get that for you.
And can you give us a readout on that when it has
will.
happened?
You don't envision them having any problems leaving the country, do you?
We do not.
No. Still on Egypt, but not that subject. Justice Ginsburg was just there. I know that last week she and the Secretary had met, I presume not to discuss any interest the Secretary might have in being on the Supreme Court, but rather to discuss this trip. Can you give us any detail about it, what the State Department in general thinks about visits of experts like these? She went to Tunisia as well to transitioning democracies.
Well, justices of the Supreme Court over many years have been very generous in participating in State Department-led programs to go see counterparts in other countries, particularly in countries where we are working together on reform of the judicial sector, particularly checks and balances on jurisprudence, writing constitutions, these kinds of things. And Justice Ginsburg, NGO law as well, how the branches of government can work together. Justice Ginsburg has been a particularly active participant in those programs. She and the Secretary had a chance to talk before she went to Egypt. I don't have the details on her schedule, but I think she was seeing senior members of the justice sector in Egypt, and I'm sure she would have had a chance to talk about how non-governmental organizations are handled in the U.S. and in other democracies and the vital role they can play. But I don't, I'm afraid, have a readout at the moment on her.
Well, then less specifically about her trip, but I mean, what is the value, or what have you seen is the value of trips like these to countries that are in this transition?
Well, this gives justices, folks who are writing legislation, folks who are working on court regulations, a chance to talk to the most senior American justices and members of the judicial branch about their experiences of a lifetime of working on these kinds of issues, about various ways to solve the problems of checks and balances, etc. And it is a chance for some of these folks who have less experience in a democratic system to learn a little bit more about how we do things.